Caleb Thorne did not ask for a wife. The world had already taken one from him, leaving behind nothing but the silence that now owned his house and the small, mute ghost of his daughter. The silence was a physical thing, thick as dust on the rafters and cold as the iron stove that had not felt a proper fire in a year. He lived in a tomb of his own making, a monument to a grief so vast it had swallowed his voice and frozen his heart. So when the men from town, their faces flushed with whiskey and malice, dragged the woman to his porch, it was not an act of charity but a joke sharpened with cruelty. Garrett, the ringleader, shoved her forward. She stumbled, a small, bird-like figure in a threadbare tunic, her hands bound and her eyes fixed on the splintered floorboards. A gift, Thorne, Garrett sneered, his laughter a foul cloud in the crisp air. From the railroad. A bit of China silk to warm your bed. No charge. They saw him as a beast, a man hollowed out and living on the edge of savagery. They thought this offering would either break him completely or confirm their assessment of his monstrosity. Caleb looked at the woman. Her name, they said, was Mai. She was a piece of property, bought and sold, her humanity a footnote in a ledger. He saw the bruises on her wrists, the terror she fought to keep from her face. He should have refused. He should have sent them away with the force of his rifle, but something in their sneering faces, in the confident cruelty of their jest, sparked a cold, defiant ember in the ash of his soul. He would not give them the satisfaction of his outrage or his despair. He dropped a few coins at Garrett's feet, the metal ringing with grim finality on the porch. She's not a gift, Caleb said, his voice a rasp of disuse. She's purchased. He turned his back on them, leaving the woman standing in the doorway, a fragile spectre caught between a brutal past and an uncertain, frozen future. He did not offer her a room, only a gesture toward the cold, windowless storeroom. It was a transaction, nothing more. A cook, a cleaner. Not a wife. Never a wife. Mai followed the line of his pointing finger into the darkness of the storeroom. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, dust, and something deeper, a profound, settled sorrow. She heard the main door close, the bolt sliding home with a sound like a coffin being sealed. Her bindings were cut, but she was no less a prisoner. Here, in this remote cabin at the edge of the world, she was at the mercy of a silent, broken man whose eyes held the same desolate emptiness as the landscape outside. Fear was an old companion, a cold stone in her belly, but exhaustion was a heavier burden. She sank onto a pile of burlap sacks, her body aching from the journey and the rough hands that had passed her from one owner to the next. For a long moment, she simply breathed, listening to the sounds of the house. There was the heavy, measured tread of the man, Caleb, moving in the main room. And another sound, softer, a whisper of movement, the child she had glimpsed hiding behind his leg, a girl with wide, haunted eyes. The silence in this place was not peaceful, it was a wound. She knew she had to fill it, not with words, but with purpose. To be useful was to be safe. To be idle was to be disposable. She rose, her limbs stiff, and stepped out of the storeroom. The man was staring into the cold hearth, his back to her. The child was nowhere to be seen. Mai moved past him, her steps light, and knelt before the fireplace. The ashes were packed hard, grey and lifeless. With careful, deliberate motions, she began to clear them away, her small hands working with an efficiency born of long practice. She found the kindling box, the flint and steel. A spark caught, a tiny orange star in the gloom. She nurtured it, blowing gently, feeding it slivers of wood until a small, hungry flame flickered to life. The fire crackled, a sound so alien in the profound quiet that Caleb flinched, turning to look at her. His expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. She met his gaze for a heartbeat, then lowered her eyes back to her work, tending the first warmth this house had known in a very long time. In the days that followed, Mai moved through the house like a gentle tide, slowly eroding the shores of neglect. She did not speak to Caleb, and he did not speak to her. Their communication was a silent language of objects and actions. He would leave a sack of flour on the table, and by midday, the scent of fresh bread would fill the cabin, a warm, yeasty ghost of a memory that pricked at his senses. He would bring in a pail of milk from his lone cow, and she would turn it into soft cheese and butter. She found his wife's sewing basket, the needle still threaded in a piece of unfinished embroidery. With reverence, she set it aside and used her own needles to mend his torn shirts and patch the knees of the little girl's dress. The stitches were impossibly small and neat, a line of perfect, ordered beauty against the coarse, worn fabric. The child, Lily, watched her from the shadows. She was a wisp of a thing, all eyes and silence. Mai never approached her directly, never forced an interaction. Instead, she left small offerings in places she knew the girl would find them, a perfectly round stone polished to a soft gleam, a vibrant blue feather from a jay, a chain of daisies woven with delicate skill. She would hum, sometimes, while she worked, low, ancient melodies from a land Caleb could not imagine. The tunes were melancholic yet resilient, weaving through the silent air of the cabin like threads of smoke. Caleb found himself listening, his hand stilling as he repaired a harness or sharpened an axe. The sound was an intrusion, a violation of the sacred quiet he had cultivated, yet it did not anger him. It unsettled him in a different way, stirring something deep within the frozen strata of his grief. He began to see the house not through the grey filter of his loss, but through her actions. He saw the way the sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air she disturbed while sweeping, the careful way she arranged the wildflowers in a tin cup on the windowsill, the order she brought to the chaos of his life. She was winding the clock of his world, and he was not sure if he wanted it to start ticking again. The house was no longer a tomb. It breathed. The windows, once clouded with grime, were now clear, letting in the harsh, beautiful light of the plains. The wooden floors, scrubbed with lye soap and water, shone with a soft, clean luster. Mai had found a small, broken piece of a porcelain plate in the yard, painted with a single blue willow branch. She kept it on the mantelpiece, a small altar to a forgotten beauty. Caleb saw it every day. It reminded him of his wife, of the life that had been, and a familiar pang of anger and sorrow would tighten his chest. Yet, he did not remove it. To do so would be to acknowledge its power, to admit that this silent woman was excavating parts of him he had long since buried. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough or stitched a seam. They were small but capable, marked with scars and calluses that told a story of hardship he could only guess at. There was a grace in her movements, an economy of motion that was both efficient and beautiful. She was a presence that demanded nothing yet was slowly, inexorably, changing everything. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, he saw her showing Lily how to fold a piece of paper into the shape of a crane. The child's small hands fumbled, but she was focused, her brow furrowed in concentration. For the first time since her mother's death, Lily's attention was fully captured by the world outside her own silent grief. Caleb stood in the doorway, unseen, a sentinel at the edge of a life that was beginning to form without his permission. He felt a strange, protective urge, followed swiftly by a surge of resentment. This woman, this stranger, was reaching his daughter in a way he no longer could. She was melting the ice, and he was afraid of what he would find when it was gone, afraid of the man he would be without the armor of his sorrow. He retreated back into the cold evening air, the rising wind a welcome echo of the turmoil inside him. He was a man caught in a current, and he did not know whether to fight his way back to the desolate shore or let it carry him into the unknown. The truth all began with a single, whispered word. It was a late afternoon, the light slanting low and golden through the clean window panes. Mai was on the floor, using a piece of charcoal from the hearth to draw on a spare piece of smoothed wood. She drew mountains unlike the rugged peaks that framed the valley, and strange, elegant houses with curved roofs. Lily sat beside her, closer than she had ever dared before, her small finger tracing the lines Mai made. Mai, sensing the child's curiosity, drew something simpler, a flower with 5 delicate petals. Lily looked at the drawing, then up at Mai's face. She reached out a hesitant hand and touched Mai's cheek. The touch was featherlight, a question. That evening, when Mai returned to her cot in the storeroom, she found a small, wilting wildflower lying on her thin blanket. It was the most precious gift she had ever received. The next day, Lily followed Mai out to the small garden she had started, a patch of stubborn greens coaxed from the hard soil. As Mai worked, Lily sat on a rock, watching. Finally, she slid off the rock and stood before Mai. She pointed a small, trembling finger at Mai's chest, then moved the same finger to her own. Her lips, which had not formed a word in over a year, parted. A small, breathy sound emerged, a syllable full of a child's desperate hope. Stay. The word was a fragile bridge across the chasm of their silence. It hung in the air between them, more powerful than a shout. Mai's hand stilled in the dirt. She looked at the little girl, whose eyes were wide and brimming with unshed tears. She could not promise forever, for her life was not her own, but in that moment, she gave the only answer she could. She reached out and gently took Lily's hand, her touch a silent vow. Caleb was coming from the barn when he heard it. He froze, thinking he had imagined the sound. But then he saw them, the woman and his daughter, hand in hand, silhouetted against the setting sun. He saw the look on Lily's face, not the vacant, haunted expression he knew, but one of fragile, dawning life. The single word she had spoken cracked the foundation of his frozen world, letting in a painful, brilliant sliver of light. Winter came to the high plains not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as a ravenous wolf. A blizzard descended without warning, erasing the world in a swirling vortex of white. The wind shrieked, clawing at the cabin, rattling the door in its frame and driving fine powder through every tiny crack. The world shrank to the four walls of their small home, the fire in the hearth their only anchor against the storm's fury. And in the heart of that storm, Lily began to burn. A fever took hold of her, starting as a faint flush on her cheeks and quickly escalating into a raging fire that left her shivering and delirious. Caleb's stoicism shattered. He saw not the blizzard outside, but the ghost of another storm, the one that had taken his wife. He remembered the same fever, the same feeling of helpless terror as he watched the life he loved slip through his fingers like sand. The past rose up to choke him, and he was paralyzed, a man of immense physical strength rendered useless by the power of his own memory. He paced the small cabin, his movements frantic and purposeless, his face a mask of raw fear. He was losing her, just as he had lost her mother. The world was cruel and capricious, and all he could do was watch it take everything from him again. He was a stone, frozen in the grip of a grief that had returned with the force of the blizzard, ready to claim what little he had left. The child's labored breaths were the only sound in the cabin, a counterpoint to the howling of the wind. Caleb felt the walls closing in, the air growing thin. He was drowning in his own powerlessness, a captain watching his ship sink for the second time. He looked at Mai, expecting to see her fear mirroring his own, but he saw something else entirely. In her eyes, there was not terror, but a calm, fierce resolve. While Caleb was lost in the storm of his past, Mai moved into the heart of the present one. She became a bastion of quiet, focused action. She felt Lily's forehead, her touch gentle but certain. Then she went to the stores of herbs she had gathered in the fall, her hands moving with practiced knowledge. She crushed willow bark for the fever, steeped chamomile for a calming tea, and mixed a pungent poultice of mustard and flour to place on the child's chest. She ignored Caleb's frantic pacing, her attention solely on the small, feverish girl. She bathed Lily's face and limbs with cool water, murmuring to her in the soft, lilting cadence of her own language. The words were meaningless to Caleb, but their tone was a soothing balm against the harsh scream of the wind. For 2 days and nights, she did not sleep. She was a constant, watchful presence at Lily's bedside, a small, unyielding warrior against the sickness that sought to claim the child. Caleb watched her, his own fear a useless, roaring fire inside him. He saw the deep, purple shadows forming under her eyes, the slight tremor of exhaustion in her hands. He saw a strength he could not comprehend, a resilience forged in a crucible he could only imagine. On the second night, as she was changing the compresses on Lily's forehead, Mai swayed, her body finally succumbing to fatigue. Before she could fall, Caleb was there. He caught her, his large hand surprisingly gentle on her small shoulders. For a moment, they stood there, the only two waking souls in a world of white fury, the sick child breathing raggedly beside them. He looked into her tired eyes and saw not a slave, not a stranger, but a partner in a desperate battle. Without a word, he guided her to a chair, then went to the hearth. He returned with a tin mug of hot, sweetened tea, pressing it into her hands. He then took the cloth from her, dipped it in the cool water, and took her place at Lily's side. He had no knowledge of herbs or healing, but he could watch. He could help. He draped a thick wool blanket over Mai's shoulders. It was a simple, practical gesture, but it was the first act of genuine care he had ever offered her. Beneath the howling of the storm, something inside the cabin had shifted. The fever, as if sensing a united front, finally broke just before dawn. When the storm receded, it left behind a world scoured clean, silent and blindingly white under a newly emerged sun. The peace outside was a stark contrast to the lingering tension within the cabin. Lily was weak but lucid, the fever gone, leaving her pale and quiet. The shared ordeal had forged a new, unspoken understanding between Caleb and Mai. They moved around each other with a new awareness, the space between them no longer a gulf of silence but a field of quiet communication. A week later, when the snow had melted enough for travel, Garrett and 2 of his cronies rode out to the homestead. Their arrival was a jarring intrusion, their loud voices and boisterous laughter tearing the fragile peace. "Came to see how your China doll is holding up in the cold, Thorn," Garrett called out, swinging down from his horse. They stomped onto the porch, their eyes taking in the clean, orderly cabin with surprise. They saw Lily, pale but alive, sitting by the fire. And they saw Mai, who was stirring a pot of soup on the stove. Their gazes on her were insolent, stripping her of the dignity she had so carefully maintained. "Looks like she's earning her keep," one of the men said with a greasy smile, his eyes lingering on her form. "Maybe you'd be willing to rent her out, Thorn." "A man gets lonely," Garrett laughed and took a step toward her, his hand outstretched as if to touch a piece of livestock. "Let's have a look at the merchandise we sold you." He was a man who understood the world only through ownership and power, and he saw Mai as a thing, his joke, his to torment. He saw the change in the cabin not as a testament to her strength, but as an affront to his cruel sport. The air grew thick with menace, the scent of whiskey and malice filling the warm space. Before Garrett's fingers could even brush against Mai's sleeve, Caleb moved. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed his body between them, a sudden, solid wall of intimidation. He was taller than Garrett, broader, and in that moment, he seemed to be made of the same hard, unyielding granite as the mountains. His face, which had been a mask of stoic grief for so long, was now alive with a cold, protective fury that made the other men take an involuntary step back. His hand didn't go to the rifle mounted over the door, but it rested on the hilt of the knife at his belt, a silent, deadly promise. "Her name," Caleb said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, "is Mrs. Thorn." The words fell into the silence with the weight of stones. He let the title hang in the air, an irrefutable claim. "You will address her as such, or you will not address her at all." Garrett's sneer faltered. He looked from Caleb's flint-hard eyes to Mai, who stood behind him, her expression unreadable. He had come expecting to mock a broken man and his foreign slave. Instead, he found a fortress. He saw a man who had not been broken, but reforged. The joke was over. "Just having some fun, Thorn," Garrett mumbled, his bravado evaporating in the face of Caleb's quiet rage. He and his men backed away, their retreat clumsy and quick. They mounted their horses and rode off, their laughter conspicuously absent. Caleb stood watching them go, his posture rigid, until they were small specks against the snow. Then he turned. He looked at Mai, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she did not lower her eyes. In his gaze, she saw not an owner, but a defender. That night, he moved her few belongings from the cold storeroom and placed them beside a new bed he had built, its frame sturdy and its wood smooth. He had moved her into the heart of the house. He had moved her into his life. Spring came, and with it, a gentle transformation of the land. The harsh whites and greys of winter gave way to the tender green of new grass and the vibrant colors of wildflowers. The change in the season mirrored the change within the cabin's walls. The silence was no longer heavy and oppressive, it was a comfortable, shared space, punctuated by Lily's growing vocabulary and the quiet sounds of a life being built together. Caleb taught Mai how to work the land, how to read the clouds for rain, how to sight a rifle. She, in turn, taught him things he never knew he needed to learn. She showed him which wild plants were medicine and which were food. She taught him the names of the constellations as they were known in her homeland, painting a new map over the familiar night sky. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. The language barrier that had once seemed insurmountable was bridged by gestures, by shared tasks, by an innate understanding that grew between them like the persistent vines on the cabin walls. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed color across the horizon, Lily asleep in Mai's lap, Caleb reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. He turned her hand over and placed a small, simple ring on her finger. It was not store-bought. He had hammered it himself from a silver coin, its surface imperfect but shining. It was not a grand declaration, but it was a promise. It was an acknowledgement. It was everything he could not say, forged into a circle of metal. Mai looked from the ring to his face. His eyes, once so cold and distant, were now clear, and in their depths, she saw a reflection of herself, not as a slave or a purchase, but as the other half of this small, improbable family. She closed her fingers over the ring, her acceptance a silent answer. The cruel joke of a few hateful men had, through some strange and powerful alchemy of the human heart, become a love worth fighting for, a peace hard won, and a home built not of wood and stone, but of resilience, grace, and the quiet, stubborn refusal to remain broken.